I think I told you guys after COVID, it's not about money anymore. I want to be in business with people that I'm aligned with and that I have good relationships with. And
that was Dana White just a few months.
So here's what went down. Months back, we heard about how tight things were between Alex Pereira and his UFC bosses, but now everything's completely fallen apart. Alex just locked in this absolutely massive deal outside the UFC, and Dana White is having a complete meltdown. This isn't just about losing one of his biggest stars, it's about who Alex decided to team up with instead. Let me walk you through exactly what happened.
I think I told you guys after COVID, it's not about money anymore. I want to be in business with people that I'm aligned with and that I have good relationships with. And you don't know who anybody is until the shit hits the fan. And when the shit hit the fan, I found out who was who and what was what. And
this contract situation that sent Dana White into orbit. There's really no sugarcoating Dana White's reaction here. When word got back to UFC headquarters that Alex Pereira, their biggest moneymaker, had supposedly locked in this huge deal completely outside the company, sources say the boss absolutely lost his mind. People who've worked with White for years, who've seen him blow up countless times, said this was something else entirely. This wasn't your typical endorsement situation either. We're talking about a commercial partnership so big it could mess with the exclusive deals UFC has with their major corporate sponsors. Inside sources are calling it a multi-million-dollar arrangement that would put Pereira front and center in a business that Dana White has zero say over. Exactly the kind of move the UFC president has spent 20 years trying to stop from happening.
A tactical battle, we'll say, in the main event.
Yeah.
Crowned a new champion tonight, though. I guess, can you give us your initial thoughts on the main event tonight?
Yeah, it was, not what I expected. I expected a lot more shooting, expected a lot more exchanges. Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to see Alex back here or not tonight, but we haven't seen him yet.
What made this supposed contract so nuclear wasn't just the money involved. This reportedly wasn't Pereira adding another sponsor patch to his shorts. This was allegedly structured like a deal that could compete with what the UFC itself pays him, set up in a way that completely bypasses all the usual restrictions that keep UFC fighters under company oversight. Everything Dana White worries about when it comes to fighters getting too much independence, this contract apparently represented all of it, rolled into one nightmare scenario.
Dana, going back to Alex tonight, there's been a little bit of talk about, he's everywhere around the world, right? He's flying to Sydney, he's doing all this stuff when he could be, maybe training at home. Do you feel like that maybe affected his performance?
That's a good question. I think that's a question definitely for him to answer. I definitely don't know his schedule. I know he's been bouncing around.
White's words carried an...
The explosion happened fast, and it was intense. People describe White's face going completely red, his voice getting loud enough to hear through closed doors, and language that would shock even veteran fighters. This was real anger, the kind you get when someone you trusted completely betrays you. Office workers apparently cleared out of the hallways, while the UFC president's fury echoed through the entire building. Sources say White was yelling things like "Where did he sign what?" when the news first hit his desk. The UFC boss supposedly demanded to see every single detail in Pereira's existing contracts, looking for anything that might have been broken, any way to block or cancel this supposed deal. Legal teams got called in immediately, emergency meetings got scheduled. The whole UFC business machine went into full panic mode.
I would say yes, that Sheikh Turkey and Saudi are the dominant players in boxing right now. And basically, I'm going to run and manage the business for them. This is not an easy business to be in.
The supposed massive contract wasn't just about one fighter making moves. If Pereira really found a way to sign something this big outside UFC control, it would completely challenge the business system Dana White spent over 20 years building. Other fighters would obviously want the same kind of deals. The carefully built wall between UFC oversight and fighter independence would start cracking everywhere.
I thought I was busy. I didn't realize what busy really was until the last couple of weeks. But yeah, we're gonna. I think I told you this to you guys before, but we're gonna invest like $10 to $12 million into jiu-jitsu over the next year. So we're gonna go big on that. We're obviously going big on boxing. We're gonna continue to do what we do with the UFC, and then, switching Power Slap over to YouTube.
The Brazilian knockout king had already built quite an empire outside the octagon. But this supposed new contract was reportedly on a completely different level. His current deal with Stake.com, as their global face, is just one piece of his business puzzle. He's got partnerships with Scribe promoting their aviator game. People estimate his net worth sits somewhere between 4 and 5 million, with fight payouts including around 292,000 for UFC 300. But this supposed massive outside deal was allegedly designed to make even these impressive numbers look small. This was exactly the kind of arrangement that made Dana White see red, the type of partnership that threatened the exclusivity that UFC's corporate relationships depend on. White built his empire on having control, and this supposed contract represented losing that control completely. What made the timing of this supposed massive contract so explosive for the UFC president was everything else happening. Pereira had just reclaimed his light heavyweight belt at UFC 320 by finishing Magomed Ankalaev in only 80 seconds with a technical knockout, reminding everyone exactly why he's become one of the most dangerous finishers in the sport. This incredible victory came after he lost a unanimous decision to Ankalaev at UFC 313, a fight that Dana White himself said was disappointing because of how little action it delivered. The UFC president's worries about Pereira's outside activities had been growing for months before this supposed contract bomb went off. People were starting to question whether all of Pereira's traveling and promotional work was hurting his performance in the cage, pulling his focus away from the intense training needed to compete at the absolute highest level of mixed martial arts. There was definitely a warning tone that now seems like it predicted everything. The Brazilian had been flying all over the world, showing up in Sydney and tons of other cities, racking up airline miles instead of training time. His Scribe partnership took him to appearances at Sigma Central Europe in Rome, while his Stake.com work put him alongside other UFC athletes like Israel Adesanya. But nothing had prepared Dana White for news of this supposed massive deal that existed completely outside UFC oversight. Here was a fighter who had signed an 8-fight deal with the UFC at UFC 300, who had clearly stated that starting with that fight, he had 8 more fights locked in. And this same fighter was supposedly signing a massive deal outside the organization that could completely change the power balance between fighters and the UFC. Dana White's explosion was just the start of what looked like it would become the biggest fighter versus organization conflict in recent UFC history. This supposed massive contract had lit a fuse that couldn't be put out easily. What made this situation particularly risky for the UFC was when it all happened. The organization was in the middle of massive expansion with Dana White's attention split across multiple business projects. This supposed massive contract showed up at exactly the moment when the UFC president was least able to focus entirely on fixing the conflict through the kind of intensive face-to-face negotiation that had defined his management approach for over 20 years. Industry insiders started guessing about what this supposed massive contract actually involved. Some thought it was a major streaming platform trying to build a sports entertainment division. Others pointed to international gaming companies wanting to expand into Latin American and North American markets. Still others whispered about a group of investors trying to build a competing combat sports promotion with Pereira as the main attraction. Whatever the details were, this supposed contract represented a direct challenge to the UFC's entire business model. Dana White built his empire on the idea that the organization controlled every commercial aspect of its fighters' careers, from sponsorship deals to media appearances to competitive opportunities outside the octagon. This supposed massive contract threatened to blow a massive hole in this carefully built wall of control. The relationship between Dana White and his fighters has always operated on an unspoken understanding that the UFC comes first in all business decisions, that individual promotional opportunities exist within a framework that ultimately serves the organization's interests. This understanding has been tested many times throughout the promotion's history, with various fighters trying to push boundaries and always facing consequences when they went too far into territory. The organization considered off-limits. Dana White built the UFC into a billion-dollar business by keeping tight control over every aspect of his fighters' commercial activities. This supposed massive contract that Pereira signed represented a direct challenge to this control, a challenge that White wasn't prepared to accept without a fight. The collision between the UFC's institutional interests and Pereira's commercial ambitions had been building for months, but this supposed contract brought the conflict to a head in spectacular fashion. The UFC president has shown his willingness to draw hard lines when it comes to sponsor relationships and fighter behavior, building a reputation for uncompromising enforcement that has become legendary in the combat sports community. He famously told a major sponsor to go screw themselves when they called demanding he remove a pro-Trump video from his personal social media, showing that his principles go beyond just business considerations and that he refuses to be told what to do, regardless of how much money might be involved. The framework that UFC fighters operate within has changed significantly over the years, reflecting the organization's growing business sophistication and its increasing desire to control all aspects of fighter marketability. The organization's partnership with Reebok fundamentally changed how fighters could make money from their appearances, stripping away individual sponsor logos and replacing them with standardized clothing and a collective sponsorship payment system that centralized control over fighter commercial activities within the organization itself. This move consolidated control over fighter sponsorships while simultaneously reducing the ability of individual athletes to command premium rates for their promotional space during the most visible moments of their careers. Critics argued that the arrangement suppressed fighter earnings by eliminating the ability of popular athletes to negotiate individual sponsorship deals that reflected their actual market value. The UFC maintained that the standardized system provided fair compensation and eliminated the chaotic visual presentation of fighters covered in competing sponsor logos. For Alex Pereira, navigating this landscape required considerable skill and strategic thinking. His manager, Jorge Guimarães, has represented some of the biggest names in combat sports history, including Anderson Silva, Jose Aldo, and Glover Teixeira. This experience and guidance helped Pereira maximize his commercial potential while seemingly operating within the boundaries established by the UFC. Guimarães understood better than most managers where the lines were drawn and perhaps also understood where those lines might be tested. The collection of 13 brands that Pereira has endorsed across diverse industries represents strategic positioning that few fighters have achieved in combat sports history. Each partnership was carefully built to complement rather than conflict with his UFC obligations, creating layers of income that supplemented his fight purses and built a financial foundation for his post-fighting career. But this supposed massive contract represented something fundamentally different from the carefully calibrated endorsement deals that had characterized Pereira's commercial portfolio up to this point. Sources suggested this deal would have positioned Pereira in a commercial role that went beyond simple brand ambassadorship, potentially creating conflicts with exclusive arrangements the UFC maintained with corporate partners across multiple industry verticals. This wasn't just another sponsor logo. This was supposedly a partnership that would make Pereira a central figure in a business enterprise. The historical context for such conflicts was well established within UFC history. Brock Lesnar famously angered Dana White by publicly promoting a competitor's product during his post-fight interview at UFC 100, declaring his preference for Coors Light when Bud Light was a major UFC sponsor, paying significant money for exclusive promotional consideration. That incident resulted in what Lesnar described as a beat-down session with White, illustrating the seriousness with which the UFC president approached sponsor relationships and his willingness to confront even his biggest stars. For Pereira, the stakes were considerably higher, given the supposed scope of his outside contract. His charitable work through Instituto Poatan in Sao Paulo, providing free combat sports training, English lessons, and computer classes to over 700 children, had positioned him as a fighter with a social mission that extended beyond personal wealth accumulation. This humanitarian dimension complicated any potential conflict with the UFC, as White would need to balance his business concerns against the public relations implications of appearing to obstruct a fighter's legitimate charitable interests. Pereira's backstory of overcoming poverty and alcoholism had endeared him to fans worldwide, creating an emotional connection that transcended the typical athlete-fan relationship. His childhood in Sao Paulo involved watching martial arts classes from outside because his family could not afford the fees, informing his later commitment to providing those same opportunities for free through Instituto Poatan. The fighter's donations of over 1,000 food boxes to his hometown and $120,000 toward flood relief efforts in southern Brazil, demonstrated philanthropy that went beyond mere public relations gestures. The contractual limitations governing Pereira's activities were clear when it came to competitive fighting. Pereira stated directly that he has a contract with the UFC, and that Jake Paul knows he cannot go and fight, suggesting that Paul's callouts were primarily promotional tactics rather than genuine attempts to arrange a fight. The Brazilian champion acknowledged having one professional boxing fight and approximately 28 amateur boxing matches, demonstrating his striking credentials extended beyond kickboxing, but this supposed massive contract that sparked Dana White's explosive reaction reportedly circumvented these restrictions by focusing on commercial activities rather than competitive fighting, exploiting gaps in contractual language that had not contemplated large-scale commercial arrangements outside the fighting context. This was supposedly the loophole that Pereira and his team had identified, a way to build commercial independence without technically violating his UFC contract. White would need to balance his business concerns against the public relations implications of appearing to obstruct a fighter's legitimate commercial interests. The question was whether his legendary temper would allow for such nuanced considerations, or whether the conflict would escalate into something that damaged both parties beyond repair. The legal teams on both sides had reportedly begun analyzing every clause of Pereira's existing UFC contract, searching for language that might either prohibit or permit this supposed massive outside arrangement. The outcome of this legal analysis would likely determine whether the conflict could be resolved through negotiation or whether it would escalate into formal litigation. The combat sports world held its breath as news of the brewing conflict between Dana White and Alex Pereira filtered through the community via the whisper networks of managers, agents, and media insiders who monitor every development in the sport with obsessive attention to detail. What had started as whispers about this supposed massive contract outside the UFC had escalated into what sources described as a full-blown explosion from the UFC president, a response that reflected both his personal frustration and his broader concerns about maintaining control over his organization's most valuable assets. The reaction from inside the UFC offices was reportedly swift and intense. Executives who had grown accustomed to Dana White's volcanic temperament described this particular outburst as exceptional, even by his formidable standards, suggesting that Pereira's supposed massive contract had touched a nerve that went beyond ordinary business concerns to something more fundamental about the organization's identity and its relationship with the athletes who competed under its banner. Dana White's management style has never been characterized by subtlety or restraint, and his reputation for colorful language and direct confrontation has become as much a part of the UFC brand as the octagon itself. He has publicly stated that when sponsors challenge his authority, his response is to tell them to take their money and shove it, demonstrating a willingness to sacrifice financial relationships in defense of his principles that has become legendary within the business community. This same uncompromising approach apparently informed his reaction to Pereira's supposed massive commercial maneuvering. The UFC president's extensive business interests had expanded dramatically beyond the octagon in recent years, creating a portfolio of responsibilities that demanded attention across multiple time zones and industry verticals. His involvement in boxing through the partnership with Turki Al-Sheikh in Saudi Arabia represented a major new frontier for the combat sports empire that White had built, with the UFC president acknowledging he would be running and managing the boxing business on behalf of his new partners. I would say yes, that Turkey and Saudi are the dominant players in boxing right now, and basically, I'm going to run and manage the business for them. This is not an easy business to be in. The timing of Pereira's supposed massive outside contract coincided with unprecedented expansion for TKO, creating demands on White's time and attention that some observers wondered might eventually compromise his ability to maintain hands-on management of UFC operations. White had acknowledged investing $10 to $12 million into jiu-jitsu, going big on boxing, continuing UFC operations, and transitioning Power Slap to YouTube, creating a portfolio of combat sports properties that demanded constant attention and management. This expansion had come at a price, however, creating demands on White's capacity that raised questions about long-term sustainability. Questions had been raised about when White might need to delegate responsibilities to trusted lieutenants, with the UFC president admitting that the current year would reveal whether he could sustain his current pace of activity across all his business ventures. Against this backdrop of organizational expansion and personal strain, the news of Pereira's supposed massive outside contract demanded immediate attention at a moment when White was already stretched thin across multiple demanding business ventures. The UFC president reportedly viewed the development as a betrayal of the trust he had placed in one of his most prominent champions, a feeling compounded by the considerable promotional resources the organization had invested in building Pereira's star power. His training partner and mentor Glover Teixeira had spoken about Pereira's humanitarian ambitions, describing plans to fix houses for underprivileged families in Brazil and expand charitable operations beyond the current Instituto Poatan framework. These philanthropic goals potentially intersected with this supposed massive outside contract in ways that complicated any narrative of simple commercial opportunism. The UFC's response to Pereira's supposed massive outside contract would have implications far beyond the immediate parties involved in this dispute. Other fighters watched closely to see how the organization would handle a champion who had supposedly signed a significant deal outside UFC control, understanding that the precedent set by this conflict would shape future negotiations between the UFC and its athlete roster for years to come. Dana White's recent partnership with Monster Energy for a 5-year deal placing the brand in the center of the octagon illustrated the value the organization placed on exclusive commercial relationships that could not be diluted by competing arrangements involving individual fighters. Pereira's upcoming title defense against Carlos Ulberg, reportedly scheduled for January 24, 2025. At T-Mobile Arena on the UFC's inaugural Paramount Plus broadcast, meant the organization had significant interest in maintaining a productive relationship with its light heavyweight champion, regardless of whatever commercial disputes might be brewing behind the scenes. For Dana White, the challenge was balancing his principles about organizational control against the practical reality that Pereira represented one of the UFC's most valuable assets in an increasingly competitive market for combat sports entertainment. The UFC had generated record revenues exceeding $1.3 billion without significant contributions from Conor McGregor, demonstrating the organization's ability to thrive without any single fighter. However, Pereira's unique appeal, his knockout power, his compelling backstory, his global commercial reach, made him a difficult talent to alienate entirely. The story of Alex Pereira and Dana White represented a broader tension within combat sports between organizational control and individual athlete rights that would only intensify as the sport continued to grow and generate unprecedented revenues. The evolution of fighter commercial rights had accelerated dramatically as social media platforms gave athletes direct access to their fans without requiring organizational intermediation. Pereira represented the new model of fighter commercial independence, a champion who understood that his earning window was limited by the physical demands of combat sports, and who sought to maximize his income potential during the years when his star power was at its peak. His approach to commercial partnerships reflected a sophistication that earlier generations of fighters had rarely possessed, and this supposed massive contract outside the UFC was reportedly the culmination of this sophisticated strategy. The resolution of this situation would provide a template for future negotiations, setting precedents that would shape the industry for years to come and influencing how the next generation of fighters approached their relationships with the organizations that employed them. The question was whether Dana White's explosive reaction to this supposed massive contract outside the UFC would ultimately accommodate the commercial ambitions of his most marketable champion, or whether the conflict would create a rupture in one of the sport's most valuable relationships that could not be repaired through negotiation or compromise. The implications extended far beyond financial considerations. At stake was the fundamental question of how much autonomy UFC fighters could claim over their commercial identities, when those identities had been largely constructed through the platform the organization provided. Dana White had always maintained that the UFC created stars, rather than simply employing them, and that this creative role entitled the organization to significant control over how those stars monetize their fame. Only time would tell how this conflict would resolve. But one thing was certain: Dana White had exploded over this supposed massive contract outside the UFC, and the reverberations of that explosion would be felt throughout the entire combat sports industry for years to come. So, what does all this mean? Dana White built everything on having control. Every sponsorship, every appearance, every single dollar, it all goes through him. That's not about ego, that's pure business, and for 20 years, nobody really challenged it in a serious way until right now. Alex Pereira isn't just some fighter trying to make quick money on the side. This is someone who came from absolutely nothing, literally watching martial arts classes through windows, because his family couldn't pay for them. He turned himself into a two-division champion, a knockout machine, a worldwide brand, and somewhere in that journey, he figured out something dangerous. He doesn't need the UFC nearly as much as they need him. That's what sent Dana over the edge, not the money, not even the contract itself. It's what this whole thing represents, a crack in everything he built. Because if Pereira pulls this off, every champion watching right now is taking detailed notes. Every manager is making phone calls. Every agent is hunting for that same loophole. The UFC will get through this. They always find a way. But the game itself, that balance of power between fighters and the organization, that might be changed forever. Dana White exploded because he could see what was coming, and it scared the hell out of him.